There's something strangely peaceful about looking back through time's long corridor, and tonight we're going to trace one of history's most transformative moments, how the Black Death of 1347 to 1353 quietly rewrote everything we think we know about medieval Europe. Across centuries and continents, this story unfolds like the slowest avalanche imaginable, where tiny decisions by merchants and sailors created ripple effects that your brain probably can't fully grasp the scope of. If this feels like the kind of gentle escape into the past you've been craving, I'd love to have you subscribe and drift along with these historical journeys. Whether you fall asleep completely or just absorb a fascinating detail or two, you're getting exactly what you need right now. Take a moment to settle in, maybe dim those lights if that feels good, and know that for the next little while, there's nowhere else you need to be, because tonight, we're wrapping 600 years of history around you like the softest blanket. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine looking down from somewhere impossibly high above the earth, watching centuries drift by like clouds. You can see the vast steppes of Central Asia stretching endlessly in all directions, golden grasslands dotted with the tiny movements of nomadic tribes and their animals. The wind carries whispers of distant marketplaces and the gentle tinkling of caravan bells. Everything moves so slowly from this height, so peacefully, like watching the world's most patient dance unfold. Now let your mind drift closer, settling gently into the 14th century, where the rhythm of life follows the seasons and the stars. In these endless grasslands, small communities of prairie dogs and marmots have been living their quiet lives for countless generations, sharing their underground cities with tiny passengers, fleas no bigger than pinheads, carrying invisible companions even smaller than themselves. For hundreds of years, this has been the most ordinary thing in the world. Flea bites rodent. Rodent feeds flea, and life continues in the endless cycle that's been turning since long before humans learned to write their stories down. The local animals have grown accustomed to these microscopic neighbors. Some get sick, some recover, most carry on with the business of being prairie dogs in an enormous, beautiful, and largely peaceful world. But something almost imperceptible is beginning to shift in this ancient rhythm. The winters are growing longer and colder, the summers stranger and more unpredictable. It's the beginning of what scholars will later call the Little Ice Age, though nobody alive in 1346 has any idea they're living through a climate transformation that will reshape continents. As temperatures drop and weather patterns change, creatures that have kept to their own territories for generations begin to wander in search of food and shelter. Prairie dogs venture into marmot neighborhoods. Ground squirrels explore burrows they've never seen before. And in these chance encounters, those tiny flea passengers discover something that changes everything: new hosts with no resistance to their microscopic companions. The bacterium living quietly in these fleas, Yersinia pestis, though it won't receive that name for another 500 years, suddenly finds itself in virgin territory. Like a key discovering a lock it was always meant to open, the plague bacterium spreads through these naive populations with an efficiency that would be beautiful if it weren't so deadly. But even now, as vast die-offs begin to ripple across the steppes, this might have remained just another local ecological adjustment, the kind of small tragedy that plays out in nature's theatre without human audiences. What transforms this regional animal pandemic into humanity's next chapter is the greatest achievement of the medieval world, the Silk Road. Under the protection of the Mongol Empire, merchant caravans move like blood through arteries, carrying silk and spices, precious stones and exotic crafts from the markets of China to the hungry consumers of Europe. These same routes that have made the 14th century more connected and prosperous than any era in human history are about to survey Different purpose entirely. The black rats living in grain stores and traveling aboard merchant vessels have always been humanity's uninvited companions. Unlike their wild prairie cousins, these cosmopolitan rodents have learned that the secret to success is staying close to human civilization. They've become the world's first global citizens, accumulating frequent flyer miles on trade routes that stretch from Beijing to the Black Sea. And when the plague-carrying fleas begin jumping from dying wild rodents to these well-traveled ship rats, they buy themselves tickets on the medieval world's most sophisticated transportation network. What started as a small ecological disturbance in the grasslands of Central Asia has just boarded the express train to everywhere else. The stage is set, the pieces are in position, and the curtain is about to rise on one of history's most dramatic transformations. But right now, in the peaceful early months of 1347, most of the world still moves to its ancient rhythms, unaware that everything is about to change. The merchant galley creaks gently as it approaches the harbor at Kaffa, its black sails billowing in the warm Crimean breeze. From a distance, everything looks perfectly normal. The same sturdy walls, the same bustling docks where Italian traders have been doing business with Eastern merchants for decades. But as the ship draws closer, something feels wrong. The usual crowds of dock workers are missing. Smoke rises from too many places within the city walls. And there's a smell carried on the wind that shouldn't be there, something sweet and heavy that makes experienced sailors exchange worried glances. Welcome to October 1347, where the plague is about to board its first European-bound vessels and set sail for history. Kaffa, known today as Theodosia, sits at the perfect crossroads of medieval commerce, a Genos trading colony perched on the Black Sea coast where European merchants come to collect the exotic treasures flowing westward along the Silk Road. It's one of those places that exists purely because of geography and greed, where Italian businessmen in expensive robes haggle with Central Asian traders over prices that would make modern luxury shoppers weep. Under normal circumstances, it's basically medieval capitalism at its finest. But these aren't normal circumstances. The Mongol Golden Horde, which controls the surrounding territory, has been dealing with mysterious mass deaths among their own populations. Entire camps have been wiped out by the same strange illness that's been sweeping westward along the trade routes. And now, in what might be the most effective instance of biological warfare in human history, they're about to share their problem with their European neighbors. The Siege of Kaffa becomes one of those historical moments that sounds too dramatic to be true, but sometimes reality has a flair for theater. As the Mongol army surrounds the Italian trading post, their own ranks are being devastated by plague. Soldiers are collapsing faster than they can be replaced. The siege is falling apart not because of military strategy, but because the attackers are literally dying where they stand. This is where things get both brilliant and horrifying. Someone in the Mongol command, history hasn't preserved their name, but they deserve a footnote in the annals of strategic thinking, decides that if they're going to die anyway, they might as well take their enemies with them. They begin loading their catapults not with stones or fire, but with the corpses of plague victims, hurling decomposing bodies over the walls of Kaffa like the world's most morbid care packages. The Genos defenders, understandably disturbed by this turn of events, do their best to dispose of the diseased corpses as quickly as possible. They drag bodies to the harbor and dump them into the sea, not realizing that the damage has already been done. The plague doesn't need intact corpses to spread, it just needs the fleas jumping off the cooling bodies, and those tiny passengers are already exploring their new Italian hosts. Here's a detail that medieval chroniclers recorded with the kind of fascination reserved for truly unprecedented events. Witnesses described the plague spreading through Kaffa so rapidly that people would go to bed healthy and be found dead in their beds the next morning, often with no visible symptoms beyond the telltale swollen lymph nodes that would give the Black Death its name. The speed was unprecedented and terrifying. Modern bubonic plague typically takes several days to kill, but the medieval strain seems to have been particularly virulent. As panic spreads through the trading colony, the surviving Genos merchants make the decision that will doom half of Europe. They load their ships with whatever valuable cargo they can salvage and flee back toward Italy. These aren't just any ships, they're floating warehouses packed with silk, spices, precious metals, and exotic goods worth fortunes in European markets. They're also, unknowingly, carrying the most valuable and dangerous cargo of all, plague-infected rats and their flea passengers, who have found the ship's grain stores to be excellent accommodations. The journey across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean becomes a floating nightmare. Crews begin dying at sea, their bodies thrown overboard while survivors struggle to keep the ships on course. Some vessels arrive at their destinations with entire crews dead, guided only by favorable winds and currents. These become known as ghost ships in port records, though that term won't be coined for several more centuries. One particularly well-documented ship arrives at the Sicilian port of Messina in early October 1347, carrying what appears to be a standard cargo of Eastern luxuries. The harbour master's records, which survive to this day, note the unusual number of dead rats found in the ship's hold, though this detail only becomes significant in hindsight. At the time, dead rats were just another cleanup problem for dock workers who had no idea they were handling biological weapons. The plague's arrival in Sicily marks the beginning of Europe's transformation, though nobody realizes it yet. The initial response is almost comically inadequate. Local authorities blame the mysterious deaths on bad air from the ship's hold and order the vessel to be quarantined after its cargo has already been unloaded and distributed. It's like trying to contain a forest fire after the embers have already scattered in the wind. Here's where medieval bureaucracy shows its limitations. Port cities across the Mediterranean have elaborate systems for inspecting cargo, assessing taxes, and preventing smuggling, but absolutely no protocols for dealing with infectious diseases. The closest thing to public health policy is the occasional prayer for divine protection and maybe burning some herbs to ward off evil vapors. Their customs officials can spot a hidden bolt of silk from 50 yards away, but they're completely blind to microscopic killers. As autumn progresses, more plague ships arrive at ports across the Mediterranean: Genoa, Venice, Marseilles, Barcelona. Each arrival brings exotic treasures that European consumers have been craving, along with invisible passengers that will reshape their world. The same merchant networks that have created unprecedented prosperity are now serving as express delivery systems for biological catastrophe. The irony would be poetic if it weren't so tragic. Europe's golden age of trade and cultural exchange is literally killing the continent. The ships carrying Marco Polo's route to riches are now carrying something infinitely more precious and dangerous than any spice or silk. They're carrying the future. By winter 1347, the plague has established beachheads at every major Mediterranean port, and the fuse has been lit on medieval Europe's transformation. The black ships have completed their deliveries, and the continent is about to discover what it really means to be connected to the wider world. From those Mediterranean harbors, the plague doesn't waste time admiring the scenery. It moves inland with the efficiency of a well-organized supply chain, following the same routes that have made medieval cities rich and powerful. Picture Florence in early 1348, narrow streets bustling with wool merchants, the constant hammering of construction on the cathedral that will someday define the skyline, and the general chaos of a city that has grown too successful for its own infrastructure. Within 6 months, half the population will be dead, and the other half will be questioning everything they thought they knew about divine providence. Medieval cities, for all their charm and economic dynamism, are basically biological time bombs waiting for the right spark. Take any major urban center of the 14th century, Paris, London, Florence, Cologne, and you'll find the perfect storm of conditions for epidemic disease. These aren't the clean, planned communities that urban planners dream about. They're organic growths that sprouted around markets, rivers, and defensive walls with all the organization of a coral reef. The streets are narrow enough that you can literally reach across and shake hands with your neighbor in the building opposite, assuming you want to risk extending your arm over the open sores running down the middle of every thoroughfare. Housing consists mainly of wooden buildings packed together like kindling, with families of 6 or 8 sharing single rooms above shops and workshops. Privacy is a luxury that doesn't exist, and personal hygiene is more of a seasonal suggestion than a daily practice. But here's what makes these cities particularly vulnerable: they're magnets for people. Rural peasants flow in constantly, seeking opportunities in the wool trade, metalworking, or any of the dozen specialized crafts that urban life has created. This means you have dense populations of people with no immunity to diseases from distant regions, all living in close quarters and sharing everything from drinking water to bedbugs. When the plague arrives in these urban centers, it doesn't spread, it explodes. The same narrow streets that create such vibrant marketplaces become corridors of contagion. The same close-knit neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone else's business become perfect transmission networks for bacteria that travel in flea bites and respiratory droplets. Florence provides one of the best documented examples of urban collapse, partly because Giovanni Boccaccio lived through it and wrote about the experience in his introduction to the Decameron. According to his eyewitness account, the city transformed almost overnight from Italy's banking capital into something resembling a medieval zombie apocalypse, except the zombies were actually just corpses and the survivors were trying very hard not to join them. Boccaccio describes scenes that sound too dramatic for fiction: entire families found dead in their homes, bodies lying unburied in the streets because there weren't enough living people to dispose of them, and a complete breakdown of social order as people abandoned their neighbors, their duties, and sometimes their own children to save themselves. The famous Florentine work ethic that had built an empire of banking and textiles evaporated in the face of biological catastrophe. Here's a detail that really captures the speed of the transformation: Florence's wool guild, which normally kept meticulous records of every transaction and membership change, simply stops recording entries for months at a time during 1348. It's not that they switched to a different record-keeping system. The scribes were dead, the guild masters were dead, and half the wool workers were dead. An entire economic system just stopped. The plague's urban strategy seems almost designed for maximum psychological impact. It doesn't kill randomly, it follows predictable patterns that terrify medieval people in ways that random disasters wouldn't. Families tend to die together as fleas spread through shared bedding and close contact. Neighborhoods with the poorest sanitation get hit first and hardest. And because medieval people have no concept of bacterial transmission, they watch these patterns and draw all sorts of creative but incorrect conclusions about divine punishment and moral failings. Paris, Europe's largest city with perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, becomes a case study in how quickly urban civilization can unravel. The city's famous university, which has attracted scholars from across Christendom, essentially shuts down as professors and students either die or flee. The construction sites that have been reshaping the city skyline, including work on Notre Dame Cathedral, fall silent as entire crews of stonemasons and carpenters vanish. What's particularly striking about the urban plague experience is how it reveals the fragility of medieval infrastructure. These cities have grown complex systems for supplying food, managing waste, and maintaining order, but all of these systems depend on having enough healthy people to operate them. When a significant percentage of the population dies in a matter of weeks, everything breaks down simultaneously. The bakers who supply daily bread are dead. The officials who organize waste removal are dead. The guards who maintain order are dead. The priests who provide spiritual comfort are dead, and their deaths are particularly demoralizing because medieval people expect holy men to have some special protection from divine punishment. London offers another fascinating case study because English administrative records are remarkably thorough. Court records show a dramatic spike in property disputes as people try to claim the belongings of dead neighbors, followed by months where the courts barely function because there aren't enough living officials to process cases. Tax collection, that most reliable of medieval activities, simply stops in many areas because there's nobody left to tax and nobody left to collect the taxes. Here's a quirky detail that shows how desperate cities become. Several European cities begin offering citizenship and property to anyone willing to move there and help repopulate. Basically, they're running medieval immigration programs designed to replace their dead populations. Some of these offers are incredibly generous: free housing, tax exemptions, and immediate guild membership for skilled craftsmen willing to relocate to plague-devastated areas. The transformation happens so quickly that many cities lose the knowledge of their own systems. Craftsmen who knew specialized techniques die before they can train apprentices. Administrative procedures that existed only in the memories of long-serving officials vanish overnight. Some cities literally forget how to maintain their own infrastructure. Sewage systems back up, bridges go unrepaired, and public buildings decay because nobody remembers who was responsible for their upkeep. By the end of 1348, Europe's great cities have become archaeological sites of their former selves, full of empty buildings and abandoned projects that will remain unfinished for decades. The urban revolution that had been transforming medieval society has ground to a halt, leaving behind ghost towns that somehow still have living people wandering through them. But what exactly happens to transform a thriving merchant or a busy craftsman into another body for the growing piles outside city walls? The medieval chroniclers, bless their observational skills, documented the plague's progression through the human body with the kind of clinical detail that would make modern medical students uncomfortable. They had no idea what was actually happening inside their patients, but they watched the external signs with the fascination of people witnessing something unprecedented and terrifying. The process begins quietly, almost politely. You're going about your normal medieval business, maybe haggling over the price of grain, or gossiping with neighbors about the strange rumors coming from the port cities. Then you notice a small, itchy bump where something seems to have bitten you. In a world where flea bites are as common as sunrise, this doesn't register as particularly concerning. Medieval people live with constant insect companions, and a few new bites hardly qualify as noteworthy events. But this isn't an ordinary flea bite. When that blocked flea regurgitated bacteria-laden blood into your skin, it delivered millions of Yersinia pestis cells directly into your lymphatic system, essentially injecting enemy soldiers behind your body's defensive lines. These bacterial invaders have a strategy that would impress military tacticians. Instead of fighting your immune system head-on, they hijack it. The bacteria actually climb inside your white blood cells, the very defenders meant to protect you, and use them as luxury transportation throughout your body. It's like enemy spies, stealing police cars to cruise around a city undetected. Your immune system not only fails to stop the invasion, it actually provides the invasion with guided tours of your most vulnerable organs. Within a day or two, you start feeling generally unwell. Nothing dramatic at first, just the kind of fatigue and mild fever that might signal an ordinary cold or the result of too much ale the night before. Medieval people are accustomed to feeling vaguely sick. It's basically the default state of human existence in an era without soap, antibiotics, or any concept of bacteria. So you probably continue working, interacting with family and neighbors, and going about your daily routine while unknowingly serving as a walking biological weapon. But then the lymph nodes begin to swell. This is where the plague announces its presence. With unmistakable authority, your body's lymphatic system, designed to filter out infections and toxins, becomes overwhelmed by the sheer number of bacterial invaders. The lymph nodes in your groin, armpits, and neck begin to enlarge as they desperately try to contain the spreading infection. These swellings, which medieval people call buboes, giving bubonic plague its name, grow with horrifying speed. Within hours, they can expand from barely noticeable lumps to grotesque masses the size of chicken eggs or even larger. The skin over these swellings turns black and purple as blood vessels rupture under pressure, creating the dark patches that earn this disease its other name, the Black Death. The pain is reportedly excruciating. Medieval accounts describe victims writhing in agony, unable to find any position that provides relief. The buboes are essentially pressure cookers of infected tissue, and any movement or touch sends waves of pain through the already suffering patient. Some chroniclers note that victims would scream when anyone approached their beds, terrified that even gentle attempts to provide comfort would intensify their torment. Here's where medieval medicine shows its limitations in ways that would be comical if they weren't so tragic. Physicians, operating under the theory that disease results from imbalanced bodily humors, prescribe treatments that often accelerate death rather than prevent it. Bloodletting, already a questionable practice under the best circumstances, becomes actively dangerous when applied to patients whose cardiovascular systems are already under bacterial assault. Some doctors recommend lancing the buboes to release corrupted matter, which occasionally provides temporary pain relief but also creates open wounds that invite secondary infections. Others prescribe various herbal concoctions that range from merely useless to actively poisonous. A few particularly creative medical minds suggest that patients should be buried up to their necks in fresh manure, based on the theory that the Earth's natural warmth will draw out the disease. Spoiler alert, this doesn't work. As the infection progresses, victims develop what modern medicine recognizes as septicemia, bacteria spreading through the bloodstream and affecting multiple organ systems simultaneously. Medieval observers note that patients' skin often takes on a dark, mottled appearance as blood vessels throughout the body begin to fail. Breathing becomes labored as the lungs fill with fluid. The heart, working overtime to pump blood through infected tissues, begins to give out under the strain. But here's where the plague shows its most sinister characteristic. Some victims develop what chroniclers describe as a kind of madness in their final hours. Modern medical analysis suggests this results from bacterial toxins affecting the brain, but medieval witnesses interpret it as evidence of demonic possession or divine punishment. Patients reportedly laugh uncontrollably, speak in tongues, or claim to see visions of angels and demons battling around their deathbeds. The timeline from first symptoms to death varies, but medieval accounts suggest most victims die within 3 to 5 days of developing the telltale buboes. Some chroniclers note cases where people appeared to recover, the fever broke, the swelling reduced, and family members began to hope, only to have the patient die suddenly from what we now understand was heart failure or internal bleeding. One particularly grim detail that appears in numerous medieval sources: the smell. Plague victims apparently develop a distinctive odor in their final stages, described by witnesses as sickeningly sweet, like rotting flowers mixed with something metallic. This scent becomes so associated with impending death that family members learn to recognize it as a sign to begin preparing funeral arrangements. The psychological impact of watching this process unfold in loved ones proves almost as devastating as the physical disease itself. Medieval people are accustomed to death, infant mortality is high, accidents are common, and violence is a regular feature of daily life. But they're not prepared for disease that kills so quickly, so painfully, and with such obvious progression from health to horror. Families watch helplessly as parents, children, and siblings transform from familiar people into something almost unrecognizable, swollen, darkened, delirious creatures who bear little resemblance to the humans they were just days before. The speed of this transformation violates every assumption medieval people hold about the natural order of illness and recovery. By the time you understand what's happening to your body, it's far too late to do anything about it. The bacterial invasion has already won, and all that remains is the final biological collapse that will add your name to the growing lists of the dead. As word spreads from house to house, street to street, and city to city about the horrible deaths taking their neighbors, something almost as dangerous as the plague itself begins to spread through medieval Europe: pure, primal terror. Fear, it turns out, travels much faster than bacteria. It doesn't need fleas or rats or trade routes, just human voices whispering increasingly dramatic versions of what they've seen and heard. And in a world without newspapers, television, or any reliable way to verify information, rumors grow like mushrooms in the dark, feeding on themselves until they bear no resemblance to reality. The initial response in most communities follows a predictable pattern that would be familiar to anyone who's watched modern people react to crisis: denial, followed by blame, followed by panic, followed by every person for themselves chaos that makes the original problem infinitely worse. Medieval people, despite their reputation for fatalistic acceptance of divine will, turn out to be just as capable of losing their collective minds as any other generation of humans facing existential threats. It starts with whispered conversations in market squares. A merchant from Florence mentions that his cousin's neighbor died strangely. A traveling priest describes seeing unusual numbers of funerals in Genoa. A grain dealer notes that his usual suppliers from Sicily haven't been responding to orders. These fragments of information get passed along, embellished, and combined until what started as "some people are getting sick" becomes a divine curse is sweeping the world and nobody who catches it survives. The medieval communication network, which normally moves information at the pace of walking horses and sailing ships, suddenly discovers the speed of light when it comes to spreading terror. Stories that would normally take weeks to travel between cities are somehow racing ahead of actual plague outbreaks, arriving in distant towns complete with increasingly elaborate details about the horrible deaths awaiting everyone. Here's where things get genuinely bizarre. Many communities receive news of their own doom before they've encountered a single case of actual plague. Towns in northern France are hearing detailed accounts of the Black Death weeks before any infected ships reach their coasts. English villages are preparing for the apocalypse based on stories from continental traders who may or may not have actually witnessed what they're describing. Fear becomes its own epidemic, spreading faster and reaching farther than the disease it's supposed to warn people about. The psychological impact proves devastating. Medieval people live in a world where death is common and life is uncertain, but they operate under certain assumptions about the natural order of things. Diseases are supposed to affect the weak, the elderly, or the sinful. Good Christians who attend Mass and pay their tithes should receive divine protection. When a disease appears that seems to kill randomly, healthy adults, innocent children, even priests and monks, it violates everything medieval theology has taught people to expect. This cognitive dissonance creates a mental crisis that manifests in increasingly desperate behavior. Some communities decide the best response is to flee en masse, abandoning their homes, businesses, and agricultural cycles to seek safety in distant locations that are probably no safer than where they started. These refugee movements spread both disease and panic to previously unaffected areas while simultaneously destroying the social and economic systems that might have helped communities weather the crisis. Other towns decide that isolation is the answer, posting armed guards on roads and bridges to prevent anyone from entering their territories. This strategy occasionally works in the short term, but it also cuts communities off from food supplies, trade goods, and information that might actually help them respond effectively to the approaching crisis. Some isolated towns end up starving before the plague even reaches them. The breakdown of normal communication creates an information vacuum that gets filled with increasingly creative explanations for what's happening. Without scientific understanding of disease transmission, medieval minds default to the explanations that make sense within their existing worldview. The plague must be either divine punishment for collective sin or the work of demonic forces, possibly in collaboration with human agents. This is where the situation goes from tragic to genuinely horrifying. Communities looking for human agents to blame for their supernatural punishment don't have to look far to find convenient scapegoats. Jewish communities, who have always existed at the margins of medieval Christian society, become obvious targets for people who need someone to hold responsible for incomprehensible suffering. The logic, such as it is, goes something like this. The plague is obviously supernatural in origin, but it's affecting entire Christian communities, so it can't be simple divine punishment for individual sins. Therefore, it must be the result of a coordinated attack on Christendom itself. Who would want to destroy Christian society? The same people who medieval propaganda already blames for killing Christ. The Jews must be poisoning wells, cursing crops, or performing dark magic to bring this catastrophe upon faithful Christians. These accusations spread even faster than the plague rumors, and with even more devastating results. Communities that haven't seen a single case of disease begin organizing pogroms against their Jewish neighbors based on nothing more than paranoid speculation and the need to blame someone for their fear. The irony is bitter. People die from panic about the plague before the plague itself ever reaches their communities. Here's a detail that shows how thoroughly fear warps judgment. Several towns actually expel or murder their entire Jewish populations, then watch in horror as the plague arrives anyway, and kills just as many Christians as it would have if they hadn't committed these atrocities. The disease, of course, doesn't care about religious affiliation or ethnic identity. Bacteria are remarkably egalitarian in their choice of hosts. The panic also disrupts the very systems that might help communities respond effectively to the crisis. Merchants stop traveling, which cuts off supplies of food and medicine. Administrative officials flee their posts, leaving no one to coordinate relief efforts or maintain basic public services. Even clergy, who are supposed to provide spiritual comfort during times of crisis, often abandon their congregations to seek safety elsewhere. This creates a cascade of secondary disasters that prove just as deadly as the plague itself. Crops go unharvested because farmers have fled or died, leading to famine conditions that weaken survivors and make them more susceptible to disease. Sanitation systems collapse because there's no one left to maintain them, creating perfect breeding conditions for other diseases. Social order breaks down as desperate people resort to looting and violence to secure resources for themselves and their families. Perhaps most tragically, the panic prevents communities from learning effective responses to the crisis. A few towns accidentally discover that isolating sick individuals and improving sanitation can slow the disease's spread, but this knowledge doesn't get shared because normal communication networks have been severed by fear and social breakdown. By 1348, fear has become its own epidemic, racing ahead of the plague and often proving more destructive than the disease itself. Communities are tearing themselves apart in anticipation of disasters that may never arrive, while others are so paralyzed by terror that they fail to take even basic precautions that might save lives. In this atmosphere of terror and confusion, medieval Europe turns to the one institution that's supposed to have answers for incomprehensible suffering, the Church. But when priests and bishops prove just as mortal as everyone else, dying at the same horrific rates as their congregations, it creates a theological crisis that shakes the foundations of medieval Christianity. If God's chosen representatives have no special protection from this divine punishment, then what does that say about everything the Church has been teaching about salvation, righteousness, and the natural order of creation? The religious response to the Black Death reveals both the best and worst of medieval spirituality. On one hand, you have countless examples of genuine heroism, priests who stay with their dying congregations when they could flee, monks who convert their monasteries into makeshift hospitals, and ordinary believers who risk their own lives to care for plague victims. On the other hand, you get some of the most bizarre and disturbing religious movements in European history, born from desperation and a desperate need to do something, anything, that might convince God to end the suffering. The theological problem is genuinely complex. Medieval Christianity operates on the premise that God is both all-powerful and perfectly just, which means that large-scale suffering must serve some divine purpose. But the plague doesn't seem to follow any of the rules that medieval people expect from divine punishment. It kills saints along with sinners, children along with adults, and seems to strike communities almost randomly regardless of their spiritual devotion or moral behavior. Some religious authorities try to maintain traditional explanations: the plague is God's punishment for the sins of the age, and the proper response is increased prayer, penance, and charitable giving. Pope Clement VI, safely isolated in his palace at Avignon, issues papal bulls calling for special prayers and promising spiritual rewards for those who care for plague victims. This conventional response makes theological sense and provides some comfort to believers who need to believe that their suffering serves a divine purpose. But for many medieval Christians, traditional prayers and penance don't feel adequate to address a catastrophe of this magnitude. If ordinary religious observance were sufficient, surely God would have protected the faithful. The fact that the plague continues to spread, despite increased church attendance and charitable giving, suggests that more dramatic measures are required. Perhaps God demands a more spectacular demonstration of human repentance and devotion. Enter the flagellants, one of history's most extreme religious movements, born from the intersection of genuine faith, psychological trauma, and mass hysteria. These groups of lay Christians, mostly men but including some women, organize themselves into traveling processions that move from town to town performing elaborate public penances designed to convince God to lift the plague from Christian Europe. The flagellant ritual is both mesmerizing and disturbing to witness. Participants strip to the waist and march in organized formations while whipping themselves with leather scourges embedded with metal spikes. They follow specific choreographed movements, falling to the ground in patterns that represent the crucifixion, then rising to continue their self-mortification while singing hymns that echo through medieval streets like something from a fever dream. These processions attract enormous crowds wherever they appear. Medieval people, desperate for any sign that someone has found an effective way to address the crisis, treat the flagellants as celebrities. Towns compete to host these dramatic demonstrations of faith, believing that divine favor might protect communities that show proper appreciation for such spectacular penance. Here's where things get weird even by medieval standards. The flagellant movement develops its own theology that puts it increasingly at odds with church authority. These groups begin to claim that their suffering can substitute for traditional religious observances, that 33 days of public self-flagellation, representing the years of Christ's earthly life, provides complete forgiveness of sins and guarantees salvation without requiring priests, sacraments, or any other church-mediated religious practices. This is basically medieval crowdsourced theology, and it makes church authorities deeply nervous. If people can achieve salvation through public self-torture, what do they need priests for? If flagellant processions can end the plague, why bother with traditional prayers and church attendance? The movement threatens to bypass the entire institutional structure of medieval Christianity. Pope Clement VI initially tolerates the flagellants as a potentially useful expression of popular piety, but by 1349 he is condemning them as heretical and ordering local authorities to suppress their activities. This creates a strange situation where people who are literally bleeding for their faith find themselves declared enemies of the church they're trying to serve. But the flagellants aren't the only creative religious response to the crisis. Some communities organize elaborate penitential processions featuring entire populations walking barefoot through their towns while carrying religious relics and singing psalms. Others stage passion plays that reenact Christ's crucifixion with unprecedented realism, hoping that dramatic demonstrations of faith might convince God to spare their communities. A few particularly desperate towns attempt to bargain directly with God through spectacular, charitable gestures. One Italian city promises to build a magnificent new cathedral if the plague ends within a specified time period. Several French communities vow to give away all their worldly possessions to the poor if divine intervention saves them from the approaching epidemic. Here's a detail that shows how thoroughly the plague disrupts normal religious practice. Many churches actually run out of holy water, blessed oil, and consecrated wine because demand for religious services increases dramatically while supply chains for religious materials collapse along with everything else. Some priests resort to blessing ordinary water and wine in emergency ceremonies that would have been considered scandalous under normal circumstances. The breakdown of normal church hierarchy creates opportunities for religious innovation that would be unthinkable in peaceful times. Lay people begin performing sacraments normally, reserved for clergy, hearing confessions, conducting funeral services, and even attempting to consecrate communion bread when no priests are available. This emergency democratization of religious authority permanently changes the relationship between medieval Christians and their church. Perhaps most significantly, the plague spawns the beginning of what historians call devotional individualism, the idea that personal relationship with God might be more important than institutional religious observance. When churches prove just as vulnerable to plague as anywhere else, and when priests die at the same rates as their congregations, ordinary believers begin to question whether salvation really requires priestly mediation. Some of the most moving religious responses to the plague come from communities that decide to face death together rather than flee. Entire monastic communities choose to remain at their posts caring for plague victims, even when they know this decision means almost certain death. These acts of collective sacrifice provide examples of genuine heroism that contrast sharply with the bizarre extremism of movements like the Flagellants. But even these heroic responses create theological problems. If holy men and women die, serving God and their communities, what does their death mean? Are they martyrs who achieve immediate salvation, or are they also being punished for some collective sin? Medieval theology struggles to provide satisfying answers to questions that challenge basic assumptions about divine justice and protection. By the end of 1348, the religious landscape of Europe has been permanently altered. Traditional church authority has been weakened by its obvious inability to prevent or end the plague. New forms of popular religious expression have emerged from the crisis and proven remarkably persistent even after the immediate emergency passes. And ordinary believers have begun to develop more personal, individualized relationships with their faith, changes that will eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation 2 centuries later. When communities desperately seeking explanations for incomprehensible suffering can't find satisfactory answers from their religious authorities, they inevitably turn to a darker and more dangerous solution, finding someone to blame. And in medieval Europe, there's always been a convenient group of people living just outside the protective boundaries of Christian society, prosperous enough to inspire resentment, different enough to seem suspicious, and powerless enough to attack with relative safety. The Jewish communities that have been quietly contributing to medieval commerce and culture for centuries are about to become Europe's chosen scapegoats for a disaster they had no more control over than anyone else. The persecution that follows represents one of history's most tragic examples of how crisis can transform ordinary prejudice into genocidal violence. Medieval anti-Semitism isn't new. It's been simmering in the background of European society for generations, occasionally boiling over into local violence but usually contained by the practical reality that Jewish merchants, moneylenders, and craftsmen provide services that Christian communities actually need. But the Black Death creates the perfect storm of fear, religious hysteria, and social breakdown that turns manageable bigotry into systematic extermination. The accusations that emerge follow a predictable pattern that reveals more about medieval Christian psychology than about any actual Jewish behavior. Since the plague must have supernatural origins, and since it's affecting faithful Christians along with everyone else, it can't be simple divine punishment for individual sins. Therefore, it must be the result of a coordinated attack on Christendom itself, and who better to blame than a group that medieval propaganda has already spent centuries portraying as enemies of Christian civilization? The most common accusation is well poisoning, which has a certain medieval logic to it even though it makes no scientific sense whatsoever. Jewish communities often have slightly better sanitation practices than their Christian neighbors, not because they understand bacteria, but because Jewish law includes various cleanliness requirements that accidentally provide some protection against disease transmission. When Christians notice that Jewish neighborhoods sometimes have lower death rates during the early stages of plague outbreaks, the explanation that makes sense within their worldview isn't they have better hygiene practices, but rather they must be immune because they're the ones causing it. The well poisoning theory spreads across Europe with the same viral efficiency as the plague rumors themselves, picking up elaborate details as it travels. By the time these stories reach German towns, they include specific descriptions of the poisons supposedly being used, mysterious powders made from ground Christian hearts, or potions brewed from desecrated communion wafers. Some versions claim that Jewish communities are following instructions from a secret council of rabbis headquartered in Spain, coordinating a continent-wide conspiracy to destroy Christian Europe. Here's where the accusations become almost comically elaborate. Several towns claim to have discovered written instructions from this supposed Jewish conspiracy, complete with detailed recipes for plague-causing poisons and maps showing which wells to target. These documents, obviously forged by local authorities looking for evidence to justify predetermined conclusions, are treated as definitive proof of Jewish guilt and circulated as evidence to neighboring communities. The first major pogrom occurs in southern France during the autumn of 1348, and it sets the pattern for what follows across the continent. Local authorities arrest prominent members of the Jewish community on charges of well poisoning, torture them until they confess to crimes they obviously didn't commit, then use these forced confessions as justification for attacking the entire Jewish population. The torture methods used are particularly creative. Some victims are reportedly stretched on racks until they agree to admit poisoning wells they've never been near, in towns they've never visited. What makes these pogroms especially tragic is their systematic nature. This isn't random mob violence, it's organized persecution that often involves local government officials, church authorities, and prominent Christian merchants working together to eliminate Jewish communities and seize their property. Many towns that haven't even experienced plague outbreaks yet use the crisis as an excuse to settle old economic grudges and eliminate competitors in local trade networks. The violence that follows is horrific even by medieval standards. Entire Jewish quarters are burned with their inhabitants locked inside. Families are dragged from their homes and murdered in public squares while crowds cheer. Children are killed along with their parents, and pregnant women are subjected to particularly brutal violence that medieval chroniclers describe in detail that's too graphic for comfortable reading. Here's a detail that shows the organized nature of these persecutions. Several German cities coordinate their attacks to prevent Jewish refugees from finding safety in neighboring towns. They essentially create killing fields that stretch across entire regions, ensuring that families fleeing one massacre walk directly into another. Some communities that initially offer sanctuary to Jewish refugees later change their minds and participate in the violence themselves. The economic motivation behind much of this persecution becomes obvious when you look at what happens to Jewish property after the massacres. Houses, shops, and warehouses that belonged to murdered families are quickly redistributed among Christian neighbors. Debts owed to Jewish moneylenders are conveniently cancelled, and valuable goods from Jewish merchants are absorbed into Christian commercial networks. Some towns become measurably wealthier after eliminating their Jewish populations, which provides a financial incentive that has nothing to do with religious or medical concerns. But perhaps the most bitter irony is that the persecution often proves completely counterproductive even from the persecutor's own perspective. Jewish communities that have better survival rates during the early stages of plague outbreaks aren't immune to the disease, they're just experiencing delayed infections due to their slightly better hygiene and sometimes more isolated living situations. After the massacres, when the plague finally reaches these Christian communities in full force, it kills just as many people as it would have if they hadn't committed these atrocities. Some towns literally exterminate their entire Jewish populations, then watch in horror as the Black Death arrives anyway and decimates their Christian inhabitants. The disease, of course, doesn't discriminate based on religious affiliation. Bacteria are remarkably egalitarian in their choice of hosts. Communities that thought they had solved their plague problem by eliminating Jewish scapegoats discover that they've simply murdered their neighbors for nothing. The persecution spreads across Central Europe like a secondary epidemic, reaching communities that haven't even encountered the plague yet. Towns in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland organize preemptive massacres based on nothing more than rumors and the assumption that killing Jews will provide protection from approaching disaster. It's genocide motivated by panic, executed by people who genuinely believe they're protecting their families and communities. A few voices speak out against the violence, but they're overwhelmed by the mob mentality that grips much of Europe during 1348 and 1349. Pope Clement VI issues a papal bull, pointing out that Jews are dying from the plague at the same rates as Christians, which proves they're not responsible for causing it. But papal authority carries little weight when communities are in the grip of collective hysteria and local authorities are more interested in seizing Jewish property than protecting Jewish lives. By the end of 1349, entire regions of Europe have been ethnically cleansed of Jewish populations that had been contributing to local economies and culture for centuries. Some communities that had hosted thriving Jewish quarters for generations become entirely Christian towns, with former synagogues converted to churches and Jewish cemeteries, plowed under for farmland. The long-term consequences of this persecution extend far beyond the immediate tragedy. Europe loses much of its most educated and commercially sophisticated population just when those skills are most needed for recovery from the plague. Jewish merchants who had maintained trade networks across the continent are gone. Jewish scholars who had preserved classical learning are dead, and Jewish artisans who had mastered specialized crafts have been eliminated. The persecutions also establish precedents for organized anti-Semitic violence that will echo through European history for centuries. The techniques developed for identifying, isolating, and exterminating Jewish communities during the Black Death become templates for future pogroms and eventually contribute to the systematic approaches used during the Holocaust. While communities are tearing themselves apart looking for scapegoats, something even more fundamental is quietly collapsing beneath their feet. The entire economic system that has made medieval Europe prosperous and stable for the past 2 centuries. The same commercial networks that carried the plague from Asia are now shutting down one by one, creating a cascade of financial disasters that prove almost as devastating as the disease itself. When half your workforce is dead and the other half is too terrified to leave their homes, it turns out that sophisticated medieval capitalism stops working with remarkable speed. The collapse begins with the most basic economic activity: trade merchants who have spent generations building networks that stretch from London to Constantinople discover that their entire business model depends on assumptions that no longer hold true. You need living people to produce goods, living people to transport them, and living people to buy them. When significant percentages of all 3 groups die within months, supply chains that took decades to establish simply evaporate. Consider the wool trade, which has been the backbone of Northern European prosperity. Since the 12th century, English sheep farmers produce raw wool, Flemish craftsmen weave it into cloth, Italian merchants finance the transactions, and German traders distribute the finished products across Central Europe. It's a complex system that requires coordination between dozens of cities and hundreds of individual businesses, all operating on credit. Arrangements and contractual obligations that assume everyone involved will still be alive. Next year. The plague doesn't just kill people, it kills the institutional memory that keeps these networks functioning. The master weaver in Bruges who knows exactly which English wool works best for specific types of cloth dyes, along with his knowledge of supplier relationships, built over decades. The Venetian merchant who understands the seasonal patterns of German demand for luxury textiles dyes, taking with him the commercial intelligence that makes profitable trading possible. The Flemish banker who has memorized the credit ratings of hundreds of wool producers dyes, leaving behind account books that his surviving clerks can barely decipher. Within months, industries that employed thousands of people across multiple countries reduced to scattered remnants operated by whoever happens to still be alive and willing to work. The great cloth fairs that have anchored the European economic calendar for centuries, events like the Champagne fairs in France, either cancel entirely or attract so few participants that they become pointless regional gatherings rather than international commercial events. Here's where the economic collapse gets genuinely surreal. Money itself starts becoming worthless in many areas. Medieval currency systems depend on complex relationships between different types of coins, regional exchange rates, and credit arrangements that require sophisticated record-keeping and widespread trust in institutional stability. When the institutions disappear and the record-keepers die, the whole system breaks down like a house of cards in a hurricane. Some regions experience deflation as demand for luxury goods evaporates. There's no point in buying expensive silk when you might be dead next week. Other areas see wild inflation as surviving merchants try to extract maximum profit from increasingly scarce goods. A few places develop bizarre barter economies where people trade directly in essential commodities like grain, salt, and preserved meat because no one trusts abstract monetary instruments anymore. The banking system, which has been one of medieval Europe's greatest innovations, suffers particularly dramatic collapse. Italian banking houses like the Medici, Bardi, and Peruzzi have created the first truly international financial networks, making loans to English kings and financing trade ventures from Scandinavia to North Africa. But these institutions depend entirely on the assumption that borrowers will survive long enough to repay their debts and that there will be ongoing economic activity to generate the profits needed to service loans. When kings die along with significant portions of their tax base, sovereign loans become uncollectible. When merchant ventures fail because their organizers are dead and their markets have disappeared, commercial credit becomes worthless paper. Some banking houses that have operated successfully for generations collapse within months, not because they made bad decisions, but because the entire economic environment that made their business model viable has ceased to exist. The Bardi Bank, one of Europe's largest financial institutions, fails spectacularly in 1345, even before the plague reaches its peak, partly due to uncollectible loans to Edward III of England, who is too busy fighting the 100 Years' War and dealing with plague outbreaks to worry about Italian creditors. The failure sends shock waves through European financial markets and contributes to a credit crisis that makes recovery from plague-related economic damage much more difficult. Here's a quirky detail that shows how thoroughly normal economic relationships break down. Several European cities begin paying their remaining workers in kind rather than currency, simply because there aren't enough goods available for money to buy. Some English towns start compensating their surviving officials with grants of land taken from plague victims, creating instant property transfers that completely bypass normal real estate markets. Agricultural systems, which provide the foundation for all medieval economic activity, prove even more vulnerable than commercial networks. Medieval farming operates on seasonal cycles that require year-round labor and assumes continuity from one generation to the next. When plague kills significant portions of rural populations during critical agricultural periods, entire regions can lose their ability to feed themselves. The timing of plague outbreaks proves particularly devastating for agricultural communities. The disease reaches many areas during harvest season, killing farmers just when they're needed to bring in crops that have been growing all year. Fields of grain that represent months of labor and investment are left to rot because there aren't enough living people to harvest them. Livestock wander unfed through abandoned villages, either starving or reverting to wild behavior that makes them useless for future agricultural purposes. Some regions experience secondary famines that prove deadlier than the plague itself. Areas that have been importing food from agricultural regions can't get supplies because the producers are dead. Areas that have been specializing in cash crops can't feed their surviving populations because they've been depending on food imports that are no longer available. The spatialized, interconnected agricultural system that has allowed medieval Europe to support larger populations than ever before suddenly becomes a liability when the connections break down. The collapse of normal economic relationships creates opportunities for dramatic social mobility that would be impossible under normal circumstances. Surviving peasants discover that their labor has become incredibly valuable when half the workforce is dead. Some former serfs find themselves in positions to demand wages, property rights, and working conditions that would have been unthinkable before the plague. A few enterprising survivors managed to accumulate significant wealth by taking over the businesses and property of plague victims. But this economic chaos also creates desperate poverty for people whose livelihoods depended on the complex systems that have collapsed. Skilled craftsmen who had mastered techniques for producing luxury goods find no market for their products when everyone is focused on basic survival. Merchants who had invested their entire fortunes in goods that can't be sold discover themselves penniless despite owning warehouses full of valuable merchandise. By 1349, large sections of Europe have essentially reverted to subsistence economies, where people focus on producing just enough food and basic goods to keep themselves alive. The sophisticated commercial capitalism that has been transforming medieval society for the past 2 centuries has been replaced by a kind of survival-focused localism that resembles earlier, simpler economic arrangements. The irony is profound. Europe's greatest period of economic growth and international integration has created the preconditions for its own collapse. The same global connections that made medieval cities wealthy and powerful also made them vulnerable to catastrophic breakdown when the system experienced severe stress. It's a lesson about the fragility of complex systems that remains relevant today, as our own globally integrated economy depends on assumptions about stability and continuity that could prove just as vulnerable to unexpected disruption. When the sophisticated economic networks that hold medieval society together begin to crumble, something even more fundamental starts to unravel. The entire system of political authority that has kept Europe relatively stable for centuries. The feudal hierarchy that places kings at the top, nobles in the middle, and peasants at the bottom depends on a basic social contract. The upper classes provide protection and leadership in exchange for loyalty and service from those below them. But when faced with a disaster that threatens everyone equally, it turns out that many of Europe's most illustrious leaders have the same survival instincts as everyone else. They run. The abandonment begins at the very top of the social pyramid. Kings and queens who have spent their entire lives being told they rule by divine right discover that divine right doesn't provide immunity from bacterial infection. Their response reveals something uncomfortable about medieval leadership. When push comes to shove, many of the people who claim to be divinely appointed to rule their subjects, are more interested in saving their own skins than fulfilling their supposed obligations to provide guidance during crisis. Edward III of England, who has been fighting an expensive war with France and presenting himself as a model of royal courage and leadership, essentially disappears from public view for months during the worst plague outbreaks. He retreats to isolated castles in the countryside, surrounded by carefully screened servants and guards, while London transforms into a scene from a medieval horror movie. His subjects, who have been paying taxes to support his military adventures and expecting royal protection in return, find themselves leaderless precisely when they need leadership most. The French royal family proves even more creative in their approach to crisis management. King Philip VI moves his court from palace to palace, always staying one step ahead of plague outbreaks and leaving behind a trail of abandoned administrative duties. When the plague reaches Paris, he decamps to distant provinces. When it spreads to the provinces, he moves to different provinces. It's like a macabre game of medieval musical chairs, except the music is funeral dirges and the chairs are increasingly isolated castles. Here's where royal priorities become embarrassingly obvious. Many European rulers continue to spend enormous resources on luxury items and court entertainment even while their subjects are dying in unprecedented numbers. The papal court at Avignon maintains its elaborate ceremonial schedule and continues commissioning expensive artwork while the plague devastates the surrounding countryside. It's not that these leaders are necessarily evil, they're just operating according to a worldview that prioritizes maintaining royal dignity and divine authority over practical crisis management. The nobility follows their king's example with enthusiastic dedication. Lords and ladies who have spent generations lecturing peasants about duty, honor, and service to their betters pack up their valuables and flee to remote country estates at the first sign of approaching disease. The feudal system that theoretically binds noble families to specific territories and the people who live on them proves remarkably flexible when personal survival is at stake. This creates a genuinely unprecedented situation in medieval society. Large populations of common people suddenly find themselves without any effective government or traditional authority structure. The local lord who normally settles disputes and organizes community defense has fled to a distant castle and barricaded himself inside. The royal officials who collect taxes and enforce laws have either died or abandoned their posts. The church hierarchy that provides spiritual guidance and social coordination has been decimated by plague deaths and clerical flight. Into this power vacuum step some genuinely unlikely leaders. Surviving merchant guilds in several cities essentially take over municipal government when the normal authorities disappear. Craft associations that normally focus on regulating shoemaking or bread baking find themselves responsible for organizing plague response, maintaining public order, and coordinating food distribution. Some of these improvised governments prove remarkably effective. They implement quarantine measures, organize care for orphans, and maintain basic public services better than the traditional authorities they've replaced. But the breakdown of normal hierarchy also creates opportunities for chaos that would be impossible under stable conditions. Some regions experience what can only be described as peasant uprisings that aren't really uprisings because there's no authority left to revolt against. Groups of surviving agricultural workers simply ignore traditional obligations and begin operating their farms as independent enterprises, claiming ownership of land that theoretically belongs to absent landlords who may or may not still be alive. Here's a detail that shows how completely social relationships can flip during crisis. Several European regions develop temporary systems where former serfs become employers of displaced nobles who have lost their lands and wealth to plague-related economic collapse. Peasants who survived the plague and inherited abandoned farms find themselves in positions to hire former aristocrats as labourers, creating social arrangements that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The psychological impact of witnessing elite failure proves just as significant as the practical consequences. Medieval people have been raised to believe in natural social hierarchies. Ordained by God, kings rule because they're supposed to rule, nobles lead because they're born to lead, and common people follow because that's their divinely appointed role in creation. When the supposed natural leaders prove no more capable than anyone else of dealing with existential crisis, it raises uncomfortable questions about the entire social system. Some communities respond to leadership vacuum by developing remarkably egalitarian decision-making processes. Towns that have lost their traditional governing structures begin holding public assemblies where any surviving adult can participate in discussions about community policy. These aren't formal democratic institutions. Medieval people have no concept of democratic theory, but they represent practical solutions to the problem of making collective decisions when traditional authority has evaporated. Other regions descend into genuine anarchy as different groups compete to fill the power vacuum left by fleeing elites. Some areas experience what amounts to low-level civil warfare between different factions of survivors, each claiming legitimate authority over diminished populations and resources. A few particularly chaotic regions develop warlord-style leadership where whoever can organize the most effective armed force becomes the de facto government. The most successful new leaders tend to be people who combine practical skills with enough charisma to convince desperate populations to follow them. Former soldiers who understand military organization, surviving merchants who know how to coordinate complex logistics, and occasional members of the lower clergy who can provide both practical guidance and spiritual comfort. These pragmatic leaders often prove more effective than the aristocrats they replace. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of elite abandonment is the permanent damage to the legitimacy of traditional authority. Medieval people who witness their supposed betters fleeing crisis while common folk stay to deal with the consequences develop a healthy skepticism about claims of natural superiority and divine appointment. This psychological shift contributes to social changes that will eventually challenge the entire feudal system. By 1349, large sections of Europe are effectively governing themselves through improvised institutions created by surviving common people who have been abandoned by their traditional leaders. Some of these emergency governments prove remarkably effective and persist long after the immediate plague crisis passes. Others collapse into chaos and violence. But all of them represent experiments in social organization that would have been impossible if the traditional elite hadn't demonstrated their fundamental unreliability when their leadership was most needed. The plague hasn't just killed individual people. It's killed the assumption that social hierarchy based on birth rather than competence serves any useful purpose during actual emergencies. That's a lesson that will echo through European politics for centuries, contributing to everything from peasant revolts to democratic revolutions to the eventual decline of aristocratic privilege. With traditional political authority crumbling and religious explanations proving unsatisfactory, desperate medieval communities turn to the one group of professionals who should theoretically understand disease and know how to treat it: doctors. Unfortunately for plague victims, medieval medicine in 1348 represents one of humanity's most confident applications of completely wrong theories to desperately serious problems. What follows is a masterclass in how good intentions, elaborate theoretical frameworks, and total ignorance of actual biology can combine to make catastrophic situations significantly worse. Medieval physicians approach the Black Death with the absolute certainty that only comes from having no idea what you're dealing with. They've spent years studying ancient medical texts, memorizing complex theories about bodily humors, and developing sophisticated diagnostic techniques based on examining urine colors and astrological charts. They can quote Galen and Hippocrates extensively, perform elaborate calculations about planetary influences on human health, and confidently explain why diseases occur when they occur. The only problem is that virtually everything they believe about medicine is spectacularly wrong. The foundational theory underlying all medieval medical practice is the concept of humoral balance, the idea that human health depends on maintaining proper relationships between four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this system, disease occurs when these humors become imbalanced, usually due to environmental factors, dietary choices, or astrological influences. Treatment involves restoring proper balance through various interventions designed to add or remove specific humors from the patient's system. Applied to plague victims, this theoretical framework produces treatment regimens that would be hilarious if they weren't literally killing people. Physicians examining patients with fever, swollen lymph nodes, and obvious systemic infection conclude that the problem stems from excess hot, moist humors that need to be drained from the body. The obvious solution, according to humoral theory, is bloodletting, deliberately removing blood from already critically ill patients whose cardiovascular systems are under severe bacterial assault. The bloodletting techniques employed during the plague represent medieval medicine at its most enthusiastically destructive. Physicians use various methods to drain blood from plague victims, opening veins with lancets, applying leeches to swollen lymph nodes, and creating deliberate wounds that are kept open to allow continued bleeding. Some doctors recommend removing specific quantities of blood based on astrological calculations. Apparently, the position of Mars relative to Venus determines how many pints of blood a dying person can spare. Here's where medieval confidence in theoretical knowledge becomes genuinely tragic. Many physicians continue bloodletting treatments even when patients obviously worsen after each session. Rather than questioning their approach, doctors conclude that they haven't removed enough corrupted blood yet, and intensify their efforts. Some plague victims who might have survived with basic supportive care are literally bled to death by well-meaning physicians who are absolutely convinced they are providing cutting-edge medical treatment. But bloodletting is just the beginning of medieval medicine's assault on plague victims. Physicians also prescribe elaborate combinations of herbal remedies based on humoral theory and astrological timing. These concoctions often include genuinely toxic substances, mercury, arsenic, and various heavy metals that medieval doctors believe can counteract the supposed astrological influences that cause plague. Patients who survive the bacterial infection often succumb to heavy metal poisoning administered by their caregivers. The diagnostic techniques employed by medieval physicians reveal both their desperation and their complete misunderstanding of what they're dealing with. Doctors spend enormous amounts of time examining patients' urine, categorizing its color, consistency, and smell according to elaborate classification systems that supposedly reveal the precise nature of humoral imbalances. They cast astrological charts to determine the most favorable times for different treatments. They perform complex calculations about the relationships between planetary positions and bodily organs. Meanwhile, Patients are dying from bacterial infections that could potentially be treated with basic supportive care, maintaining hydration, controlling fever, and preventing secondary infections. But medieval physicians have no concept of bacteria, no understanding of immune system function, and no effective techniques for managing systemic infection. Their elaborate theoretical knowledge is not only useless, it actively prevents them from stumbling onto treatments that might actually help. Some of the remedies prescribed during the plague are so bizarre that they sound like medieval comedy sketches. Physicians recommend that patients breathe the air around latrines because the bad smells will supposedly drive out the disease-causing vapors. Others suggest sitting in saws or rolling in manure to absorb the earth's natural healing properties. A few particularly creative doctors prescribe drinking solutions made from powdered unicorn horn or ground-up precious stones, apparently believing that magical substances can counteract supernatural diseases. Here's a detail that shows how thoroughly medieval medicine misunderstands contagion. Many physicians recommend treatments that actually increase patients' exposure to plague bacteria. They suggest that family members sleep in the same beds as plague victims to share beneficial bodily warmth. They encourage group treatments where multiple plague patients are housed together in confined spaces to concentrate healing influences. These practices, designed to help patients, create perfect conditions for spreading infection among people who might otherwise have avoided exposure. The medical establishment's response to their obvious failure follows a predictable pattern of doubling down on incorrect theories rather than questioning fundamental assumptions. When bloodletting doesn't cure plague victims, physicians conclude that they need to bleed patients more aggressively or more frequently. When herbal remedies prove ineffective, doctors create increasingly complex and toxic combinations. When astrological timing doesn't improve outcomes, medical authorities develop more elaborate astrological calculations. A few physicians begin to suspect that their traditional approaches aren't working, but they lack the conceptual framework to understand why or develop better alternatives. Some doctors notice that plague seems to spread through contact with infected individuals, but they interpret this observation through the lens of humoral theory. Perhaps the disease involves transmission of corrupted humors through proximity rather than through the miasmatic vapors they initially suspected. The complete breakdown of medical institutional authority creates opportunities for alternative healers who prove no more effective but at least avoid some of the actively harmful treatments prescribed by university-trained physicians. Folk healers, wise women, and religious healers step into the vacuum left by fleeing doctors, offering remedies based on traditional knowledge and spiritual intervention rather than classical medical theory. Some of these alternative approaches accidentally prove less harmful than official medicine, herbal teas that don't contain toxic metals, prayer and rest instead of aggressive bloodletting, and simple supportive care rather than complex interventions that weaken already critically ill patients. But they're still operating without any real understanding of bacterial infection, and their success rates remain dismally low. By 1349, the failure of medieval medicine has become so obvious that even physicians begin abandoning their practices and fleeing plague-affected areas. Medical schools close as professors die or abandon their posts. The elaborate theoretical structure that has defined European medicine for centuries collapses under the weight of its obvious irrelevance to actual human health during crisis. The plague doesn't just kill individual doctors, it kills confidence in medical authority and theoretical knowledge that isn't grounded in observable reality. This intellectual crisis contributes to eventual medical advances, but only after medieval communities learn the hard way that confidence and complexity are poor substitutes for actually understanding what you're trying to treat. In the face of such overwhelming medical failure and institutional collapse, something fascinating begins to emerge from medieval Europe's collective trauma. Entirely new forms of cultural expression that would have been unimaginable before half the continent experienced intimate, daily contact with mass death. When normal life becomes impossible, and traditional comfort systems prove useless, human creativity finds strange and sometimes beautiful ways to process experiences that exceed the capacity of ordinary language or conventional art to capture. The most visible of these cultural shifts appears in what historians call the danse macabre, the dance of death, an artistic motif that begins appearing on church walls, in illuminated manuscripts, and carved into cathedral facades across plague-ravaged Europe. These aren't the gentle, idealized death scenes that medieval art typically favored, where blessed souls peacefully ascend to heaven surrounded by angels and golden light. Instead, they depict death as a grinning skeleton who dances with victims from every level of society, dragging popes and peasants, kings and merchants into the same inevitable choreography. What makes these images particularly striking is their dark humor and egalitarian message. Medieval art has traditionally emphasized social hierarchies and the special status of religious and political elites, but the danse macabre presents death as the ultimate democrat, a skeletal figure who treats emperors and beggars with exactly the same casual indifference. In fresco after fresco, you see richly dressed nobles being led away by the same grinning death that claims humble farmers, suggesting a worldview that the plague has forced upon European consciousness. All social distinctions ultimately prove meaningless when bacteria don't discriminate. The artistic style itself represents a dramatic departure from medieval aesthetic conventions. Traditional religious art emphasizes beauty, divine order, and the triumph of spiritual over physical concerns. But plague art revels in the grotesque details of bodily decay, rotting flesh, exposed bones, worms crawling through eye sockets, and decomposing corpses that still wear the clothing and crown jewels of their former earthly status. It's as if medieval artists have decided that the only honest way to represent their current reality is through imagery that would have been considered inappropriately disturbing just a few years earlier. Here's where things get genuinely surreal. Alongside this artistic obsession with death imagery, Europe begins experiencing outbreaks of literal dancing manias that sweep through entire communities like psychological epidemics. These aren't metaphorical dances or artistic representations, they're actual cases of mass hysteria where groups of people begin dancing uncontrollably for hours or even days at a time, apparently unable to stop until they collapse from exhaustion. The dancing epidemics follow patterns that reveal the profound psychological stress affecting plague-era communities. They typically begin with one or two individuals who start dancing in public spaces, market squares, church courtyards, or village commons. Within hours, dozens of other people join the spontaneous dance, moving in increasingly frenzied patterns while singing, shouting, or making sounds that witnesses describe as inhuman. The dancing continues until participants literally drop from physical exhaustion, and some reportedly die from the exertion. Medieval chroniclers struggle to explain these phenomena using the conceptual frameworks available to them. Some interpret the dancing manias as demonic possession, evidence that the same supernatural forces causing the plague are also affecting people's minds and bodies in other ways. Others suggest that communities are collectively losing their sanity. under the pressure of watching their neighbors die in unprecedented numbers. A few, particularly creative observers propose that the dancing represents attempts to literally dance away death, as if vigorous physical activity might provide protection from the approaching epidemic. Modern psychological analysis suggests these episodes represent classic cases of mass hysteria triggered by extreme collective stress, but the medieval participants experience them as genuinely supernatural events. People who join the dancing crowds often report visions of angels, demons, or religious figures encouraging them to continue moving. Some claim to see the souls of plague victims joining the dance, or describe feeling compelled to dance by invisible forces that control their bodies against their conscious will. The dancing manias spread between communities with the same viral efficiency as plague. Rumors suggesting that psychological contagion can be just as powerful as biological infection under the right circumstances. Towns that hear about dancing epidemics in neighboring areas often experience their own outbreaks within days or weeks, as if the mere knowledge that such things are possible makes them more likely to occur. But the cultural responses to plague trauma extend beyond dramatic artistic and behavioral phenomena into more subtle changes in everyday cultural practice. European communities begin developing new forms of popular entertainment that would have been considered inappropriate or disturbing in earlier periods. Folk songs that celebrate the equality of death become popular across social classes. Stories and poems that mock traditional authority figures, kings who can't command bacteria, priests who die like everyone else, doctors whose treatments kill faster than diseases, circulate through communities that previously showed much more deference to established hierarchies. The plague also accelerates changes in religious practice that reflect fundamentally altered relationships between individuals and institutional Christianity. People begin creating more personal, intimate forms of devotion that don't require priestly mediation. Private prayer practices, individual Bible reading, where literacy permits, and direct mystical experiences that bypass traditional church authority. Some of these developments contribute to religious movements that will eventually challenge medieval Catholicism's monopoly on spiritual life. Here's a fascinating detail about how crisis changes aesthetic preferences. Surviving inventories from plague-era households show dramatic shifts in the types of art and decorative objects that people choose to surround themselves with. Before the plague, medieval consumers typically preferred religious imagery that emphasized divine protection, social stability, and the promise of heavenly reward for earthly suffering. After experiencing mass death, the same communities show increased demand for art that depicts earthly pleasures, human relationships, and the beauty of physical life, as if witnessing unprecedented mortality makes people more appreciative of sensual and emotional experiences they can access while still alive. The changes in literary culture prove equally dramatic. Pre-plague European literature tends to focus on idealized characters pursuing abstract virtues like honor, chastity, and religious devotion. But plague-era writing increasingly features ordinary people dealing with practical problems of survival, love, and human relationships under difficult circumstances. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague years, presents characters who respond to crisis by telling each other entertaining stories that celebrate human ingenuity, sexual pleasure, and the comedy of everyday life, themes that provide psychological escape from the horror surrounding them. Perhaps most significantly, the plague begins to change European attitudes toward time itself. Medieval culture has traditionally emphasized eternal spiritual concerns over temporary earthly experiences, encouraging people to think of their current lives as brief preparation periods for more important afterlife destinations. But communities that have watched half their neighbors die within months begin to place greater value on immediate experience and present moment awareness. This shift appears in everything from architectural choices, more comfortable private spaces rather than purely ceremonial public buildings, to changes in marriage and family practices that emphasize companionate relationships rather than purely economic or political alliances. When life becomes obviously fragile and unpredictable, people begin investing more energy in experiences that provide immediate satisfaction rather than pursuing goals that might never be achieved. By 1349, European culture has been fundamentally altered by its encounter with mass mortality. The artistic, literary, and social changes that emerge from plague trauma represent genuine innovations that wouldn't have been possible without the psychological pressure of witnessing civilization's near collapse. Death has become not just a biological fact but a cultural creative force that transforms how people understand themselves, their relationships, and their place in an obviously unpredictable world. While artists are creating new ways to represent death and communities are literally dancing themselves into exhaustion, Europe faces a more immediate and practical problem that no amount of cultural creativity can solve: what to do with an unprecedented number of corpses. When the systems designed to handle individual deaths completely break down under the weight of mass mortality, medieval burial practices, which have evolved over centuries to provide dignified individual interment for each member of the Christian community, simply cannot cope when entire neighborhoods die within weeks. Normal medieval death follows predictable patterns that allow communities to process loss in ways that honor both the deceased and the psychological needs of survivors. When someone dies under ordinary circumstances, family members wash and prepare the body, clergy perform appropriate religious ceremonies, and the deceased receives individual burial in consecrated ground with proper Christian rites. The whole process takes several days and involves the entire community in rituals that help everyone process grief while ensuring the dead person's soul receives proper spiritual care. But when plague kills dozens of people daily in towns that might normally experience 1 or 2 deaths per month, these elaborate individual ceremonies become impossible. There aren't enough clergy to perform last rites for every victim. There aren't enough gravediggers to create individual burial sites. There aren't enough wooden planks to build individual coffins, or enough land in existing cemeteries to accommodate the sheer volume of bodies that need burial. The breakdown of normal death management creates psychological trauma that proves almost as devastating as watching loved ones die. Medieval Christians believed deeply that proper burial in consecrated ground is essential for the soul's journey to heaven. When plague victims can't receive individual Christian burial, their families experience not just grief over personal loss, but genuine terror that their relatives' souls might be condemned to eternal punishment because of inadequate funeral rites. The first communities to experience mass plague deaths try to maintain traditional burial practices as long as possible, but the logistics quickly become overwhelming. Florence's cemetery records, which normally document individual burials with careful attention to family names, plot locations, and religious ceremonies, begin showing entries like 43 bodies buried together and numerous plague victims interred without individual rites. The administrative precision that has characterized medieval record-keeping for centuries collapses under the sheer volume of death. Here's where medieval improvisation reveals both human adaptability and the limits of cultural flexibility. communities begin digging what they euphemistically call communal graves, but which are essentially enormous trenches designed to hold hundreds of bodies at once. These mass burial sites represent complete abandonment of individual dignity in favor of basic public health necessity. If you don't dispose of corpses quickly, decomposition creates additional health hazards that could worsen the epidemic. The mass graves themselves become engineering projects that would challenge modern urban planners. Some cities dig trenches 30 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 15 feet deep, then fill them with layer after layer of plague victims separated by thin coverings of lime and dirt. Other communities create multiple smaller graves that can be filled and covered more quickly, but require more total excavation work. A few particularly organized towns establish assembler line systems where corpse collection, transportation, and burial are handled by different teams of workers who rotate duties to minimize individual psychological trauma. The workers who handle plague corpses become a distinct social class almost overnight. These aren't traditional gravediggers who deal with occasional individual deaths. They're essentially medieval sanitation engineers dealing with unprecedented public health emergencies. Many of these workers are condemned criminals who are offered freedom in exchange for handling corpse disposal duties that no one else will perform. Others are desperate survivors who accept extremely high wages for work that almost certainly means exposure to plague infection. Here's a detail that shows how thoroughly normal social relationships break down during crisis. Some communities begin paying corpse disposal workers in luxury goods looted from plague victims' homes rather than in currency, creating bizarre economic arrangements where grave diggers become wealthy by medieval standards while performing work that guarantees their own deaths within weeks or months. The religious implications of mass burial create theological crises that medieval Christianity struggles to address. Church doctrine emphasizes the importance of individual funeral rites, proper blessing of burial sites, and careful maintenance of graves so that bodies can be properly resurrected during the final judgment. Mass graves containing hundreds of unidentified plague victims mixed together in communal trenches violate virtually every principle of Christian burial practice. Some clergy try to maintain religious propriety by performing group funeral services over mass graves, blessing entire trenches full of bodies with abbreviated versions of traditional funeral rites. But many priests either die themselves or flee plague-affected areas, leaving communities to handle corpse disposal without any religious supervision. This creates situations where devout Christians are forced to choose between honoring religious requirements and preventing public health disasters. A few communities attempt creative solutions that try to balance practical necessity with religious concerns. Some towns create systems where bodies are temporarily stored in blessed buildings like unused churches or monastery halls, allowing families time to arrange individual religious ceremonies before final interment in mass graves. Others establish detailed record-keeping systems that track which bodies are buried in which mass graves, hoping that individual identification might be possible in the future. But perhaps the most dramatic departure from medieval burial practice occurs in communities that resort to cremation, burning plague corpses rather than burying them. This represents an almost unthinkable violation of Christian burial customs, which require intact bodies for eventual resurrection. But when communities run out of suitable burial space, or when they decide that immediate corpse disposal is more important than religious propriety, they begin building enormous funeral pyres that burn continuously for weeks at a time. The logistics of mass cremation prove even more challenging than mass burial. Medieval communities don't have industrial-scale furnaces or modern cremation technology. Their essentially building giant campfires using whatever combustible materials they can gather. Some cities strip wooden buildings for fuel to keep corpse-burning fires going. Others organize systematic wood collection from surrounding forests, creating supply chains dedicated to corpse disposal rather than normal economic activities. The psychological impact of watching mass cremation proves particularly severe for medieval people who have been raised to believe that burning human bodies violates fundamental Christian principles. Witnesses describe the experience of watching hundreds of plague victims burning simultaneously as evidence that their communities have been abandoned by God and left to resort to practices associated with pagan societies or demonic influences. Here's a quirky detail that shows how thoroughly practical concerns override religious scruples during genuine emergencies. Several European cities that resort to mass cremation later receive special papal dispensations forgiving them for violating church burial requirements, essentially providing retroactive religious permission for emergency public health measures. Even medieval religious authority proves surprisingly flexible when faced with the alternative of allowing plague-infected corpses to create additional health hazards. By the end of 1348, European communities have been forced to develop entirely new approaches to death management that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. Mass graves, cremation, and abbreviated funeral rites become standard practices in plague-affected areas. The individual dignity and religious care that medieval Christianity promised to every believer has been replaced by industrial-scale corpse disposal systems designed primarily to prevent living survivors from being overwhelmed by decomposing bodies. These changes in death practices prove remarkably persistent even after their immediate plague crisis passes. Many communities continue using mass burial techniques for handling epidemic diseases, creating precedents for public health approaches that prioritize collective welfare over individual religious concerns. The plague doesn't just change how medieval people live, it permanently alters how European society handles death itself. Then, quite suddenly, the dying stops. Not everywhere at once, and not completely. The plague will return in waves for centuries to come, but in community after community across Europe, the daily horror of watching neighbors collapse and die begins to ease into something almost more disturbing: silence. The survivors emerge from months of concentrated terror into a world that feels fundamentally different from the one they inhabited just a year earlier, and the quiet that follows mass death proves almost as psychologically challenging as the crisis itself. Picture waking up in a medieval town during the autumn of 1349, after the plague has finally moved on to devastate other regions. The first thing that strikes you isn't what you see, it's what you don't hear. Medieval communities are normally alive with constant noise. Merchants shouting in market squares, children playing in streets, craftsmen hammering in workshops, livestock making their daily complaints, and the general buzz of human activity that characterizes any thriving settlement. But plague-era survivors describe an eerie stillness that settles over their communities like a blanket, broken only by wind through empty buildings and the occasional footsteps of other survivors moving carefully through streets that once bustled with life. The visual landscape proves equally unsettling. Medieval towns are normally crowded, with every available space utilized for housing, workshops, or commerce. But post-plague communities are full of empty buildings, abandoned construction projects, and overgrown gardens that no one has tended for months. Some houses stand with doors hanging open, their contents scattered by looters or family members who fled in panic. Others remain sealed shut, their windows dark and their chimneys cold, waiting for owners who will never return. Here's where the psychological impact of survival becomes particularly complex. Many plague survivors find themselves the inheritors of property, goods, and social positions that would have been completely beyond their reach under normal circumstances. A surviving peasant might discover that he's the only living person with any claim to his former landlord's estate. A craftsman's apprentice could find herself the sole heir to a workshop that previously employed dozens of skilled workers. Children who lost their parents might wake up to discover they own houses, businesses, or valuable goods that represent more wealth than their families had accumulated over generations. This sudden abundance creates profound psychological discomfort for people who have been raised to believe in rigid social hierarchies and limited economic opportunities. Medieval people are accustomed to knowing their place in a stable social order. Peasants remain peasants, craftsmen remain craftsmen, and social mobility occurs slowly if at all. But plague survivors find themselves thrust into economic and social positions they never expected to occupy, without any of the training, connections, or cultural preparation that would normally accompany such advancement. The emotional complexity of inheriting from plague victims proves particularly challenging for medieval people who lack modern psychological frameworks for understanding survivors' guilt. Many survivors report feeling simultaneously grateful for their unexpected wealth and deeply troubled by the fact that their good fortune results directly from their neighbors' deaths. Some develop what we might recognize as post-traumatic stress responses, difficulty sleeping, recurring nightmares about plague scenes, and intense anxiety about their own survival when so many others died. The disruption of family structures creates additional trauma that medieval society is poorly equipped to handle. The plague doesn't kill entire families uniformly, it often leaves behind randomly scattered survivors who must figure out how to rebuild kinship networks from fragments. Children who lost parents find themselves cared for by distant relatives, family, friends, or sometimes complete strangers who take them in from charitable motives or practical need for additional labor. Some of these improvised family arrangements work well and create genuine bonds between people who wouldn't normally have been closely connected. But others prove deeply problematic, especially when inheritance rights and property ownership become disputed between competing claims from different groups of survivors. Medieval legal systems, designed to handle occasional individual inheritance cases, struggle to process the volume and complexity of property disputes that arise when significant portions of entire communities die simultaneously. Here's a detail that shows how thoroughly plague disrupts normal social relationships. Many surviving communities develop informal protocols for handling abandoned property that essentially ignore traditional legal frameworks. Since there aren't enough surviving legal officials to process formal inheritance procedures, communities create their own systems, based on practical need and local consensus rather than established law. A surviving family might simply move into a larger house whose owners died, while other survivors take over abandoned shops or workshops based on their ability to operate them effectively. The psychological isolation experienced by plague survivors proves almost as challenging as the material disruptions they face. Medieval people live in communities where everyone knows everyone else's family history, business relationships, and personal circumstances, going back generations. But plague survivors often find themselves surrounded by people they barely know, fellow survivors from different neighborhoods or social backgrounds who have been thrown together by circumstance rather than choice. This social atomization makes normal medieval community life almost impossible to maintain. The informal networks of mutual obligation, shared memory, and established trust that hold medieval society together have been shattered along with the people who created and maintained them. Survivors must build new social relationships from scratch, often while dealing with their own trauma and grief over lost family and friends. Some communities respond to this challenge by developing remarkably inclusive and egalitarian social arrangements that would have been unthinkable before the plague. When traditional hierarchies have been decimated and survival depends on cooperation between whoever happens to still be alive, communities sometimes create surprisingly democratic decision-making processes and resource-sharing systems that ignore pre-plague social distinctions. But other survivor communities fracture into competing factions that fight over resources, property rights, and social leadership. Without established authorities or traditional mechanisms for resolving disputes, some post-plague towns develop ongoing conflicts that prevent effective reconstruction and create additional sources of stress for people who are already dealing with trauma and loss. The daily routines that survive plague disruption often take on almost ritual significance for people who are trying to maintain some sense of normal life in fundamentally abnormal circumstances. Survivors describe clinging to familiar activities, attending religious services, maintaining craft traditions, or preparing traditional foods as ways of asserting continuity with their pre-plague identities and communities. Here's where human adaptability reveals both its strengths and limitations. Most plague survivors do eventually develop new routines, relationships, and sources of meaning that allow them to build satisfying lives in their transformed communities. But the process takes years, and the communities that emerge from this reconstruction period prove fundamentally different from what existed before the plague. The children who grow up in post-plague communities prove particularly adaptable to their new circumstances, often developing attitudes and expectations that differ dramatically from their parents' pre-plague worldviews. These children take for granted social arrangements and economic opportunities that their parents experienced as revolutionary departures from traditional medieval life. By 1350, plague survivors across Europe are beginning the long process of building new communities, families, and economic systems from the fragments of their old lives. They've inherited a devastated but also strangely liberated world where many traditional constraints have been swept away along with the people who enforced them. What they choose to build with this inheritance will determine the shape of European civilization for centuries to come. As the survivors begin to assess what's left of their world, they make a discovery that proves even more revolutionary than inheriting their dead neighbor's property. Suddenly, their labor has become the most valuable commodity in Europe. For the first time in medieval history, ordinary workers find themselves in a position to make demands rather than simply accept whatever terms their social superiors choose to offer. The Black Death has accidentally created Europe's first genuine labor shortage, and the economic consequences prove just as transformative as the biological catastrophe that caused them. The mathematics of the situation are simple and terrifying for anyone who has been accustomed to cheap, abundant labor. Before the plague, European agriculture and craft production operated on the assumption that workers were essentially replaceable. If a peasant demanded better conditions or higher wages, landlords could easily find other desperate people willing to accept whatever terms were offered. But when roughly half the workforce dies within 2 years, the fundamental economics of labor relations flip overnight. Surviving agricultural workers wake up to discover that they're suddenly essential rather than expendable. The same lords who previously treated peasant labor as an unlimited resource now find themselves competing desperately for the services of whoever managed to survive the plague. Fields that have been cultivated for generations lie fallow because there aren't enough living people to plant, tend, and harvest crops. Entire agricultural regions face the prospect of famine not because the land can't produce food, but because there aren't enough workers to make production possible. The initial response from surviving workers reveals how quickly people can adapt to changed circumstances when their basic survival depends on it. Peasants who have spent their entire lives accepting whatever wages and working conditions their landlords dictated begin making demands that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. They want higher wages, better working conditions, more control over their daily schedules, and sometimes even formal contracts that guarantee specific terms of employment. Here's where the social revolution becomes genuinely dramatic. Many surviving agricultural workers simply abandon their traditional lord-peasant relationships and begin negotiating with multiple potential employers, selling their labor to whoever offers the best terms. Medieval serfdom, which has tied peasant families to specific plots of land for generations, effectively collapses in many regions because landlords can't enforce traditional obligations. When workers can easily find alternative employment elsewhere, the craft industries experience even more dramatic transformations. Medieval guilds have traditionally maintained strict control over who can practice specific trades, how many apprentices master craftsmen can train, and what wages different skill levels can command. But when plague kills significant percentages of skilled workers, these artificial restrictions become impossible to maintain. Surviving craftsmen find themselves in positions to demand master-level wages for apprentice-level work, simply because they're among the few people left who know how to produce essential goods. Some craft workers become genuinely wealthy by medieval standards, accumulating resources that would have taken their families generations to achieve under normal circumstances. A surviving blacksmith might find himself the only metalworker in a region that includes several towns, allowing him to charge premium prices for everything from horseshoes to agricultural tools. A weaver who survives the plague could discover that her skills are so desperately needed that she can negotiate contracts that provide housing, guaranteed food supplies, and wages that exceed what minor nobles received before the plague. The psychological impact of this economic transformation proves just as significant as the material changes it creates. Medieval workers have been raised to believe that social hierarchy is divinely ordained and that questioning traditional authority represents both practical foolishness and spiritual sin. But when their labor becomes genuinely valuable, they begin developing new attitudes about their own worth and their relationships with traditional social superiors. Here's where the panic among surviving elites becomes genuinely palpable. Nobles and wealthy merchants who have spent their entire lives assuming they could command peasant labor through traditional authority suddenly find themselves having to negotiate with workers who have alternative options. Lords who are accustomed to demanding specific services from their tenants discover that they need to offer competitive compensation or watch their agricultural workers migrate to other employers who provide better terms. The response from traditional authorities reveals both their desperation and their fundamental misunderstanding of the new economic reality they are facing. Many nobles attempt to maintain pre-plague labor arrangements through legal coercion rather than economic incentives. They petition kings and regional authorities to pass laws requiring workers to accept traditional wages and forbidding agricultural laborists from seeking employment outside their original communities. These legal attempts to artificially suppress wages and maintain traditional labor relations prove spectacularly unsuccessful in practice. When workers can earn significantly more by violating these laws than by obeying them, and when employers desperately need their services regardless of legal technicalities, the actual enforcement becomes almost impossible. Some regions experience ongoing low-level conflicts between authorities trying to maintain traditional labor arrangements and workers who simply ignore legal restrictions that no longer serve their economic interests. The most successful post-plague employers prove to be those who adapt quickly to the new economic reality and begin competing for workers through improved compensation and working conditions rather than trying to maintain traditional authoritarian relationships. These innovative landlords and business owners discover that treating workers as valuable partners rather than replaceable resources actually improves productivity and creates more stable long-term economic arrangements. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the labor shortage involves changes in European attitudes toward work itself. Medieval culture has traditionally viewed physical labor as inherently less valuable and socially prestigious than activities associated with nobility, clergy, or intellectual pursuits. But when agricultural and craft work becomes obviously essential for community survival, and when skilled workers can command higher compensation than many traditional elites, these cultural attitudes begin to shift in ways that will eventually contribute to entirely different conceptions of social value and human dignity. Some regions develop what amounts to early capitalist labor markets where workers and employers negotiate terms based on supply, demand, and competitive alternatives rather than traditional social obligations. These market-based employment relationships represent genuine innovations in European economic organization that wouldn't have been possible without the population disruption caused by plague mortality. Here's a detail that shows how thoroughly economic relationships can change during crisis. Several English regions begin experiencing what modern economists would recognize as wage inflation, where competition for scarce labor drives compensation to levels that traditional economic structures can't sustain. Some agricultural wages increase by 300% or more within a few years, creating prosperity for surviving workers that exceeds anything their communities had experienced during the supposedly prosperous pre-plague period. By 1350, the European labor shortage has created economic and social changes that prove far more persistent than the plague outbreak that caused them. Workers who have experienced genuine economic leverage and social mobility prove reluctant to return to traditional subservient relationships even when population levels eventually recover. The Black Death hasn't just killed people, it's killed the assumption that labor should be cheap, abundant, and politically powerless. These changes in labor relations will contribute to peasant revolts, the eventual decline of feudalism, and the development of economic systems that recognize workers as participants rather than simply resources in economic production. The plague survivors have inherited more than property and empty houses. They've inherited the opportunity to rebuild European society on fundamentally different principles. And so Europe awakens from its fever dream to discover that the world has been fundamentally rearranged while it wasn't paying attention. The changes that began as desperate survival measures during the plague years proved to be not temporary disruptions, but permanent alterations to the very DNA of European civilization. What survivors initially experienced as crisis management becomes the foundation for social, economic, and intellectual developments that will eventually transform medieval society into something recognizably modern. The most immediate and visible change involves the relationship between individual merit and social position. Before the plague, European society operated on the assumption that social hierarchy reflected divine will. Nobles ruled because God intended them to rule. Peasants labored because that was their ordained role in creation, and social mobility occurred rarely and slowly if at all. But plague survivors have watched traditional elites flee when leadership was most needed, witnessed common people organize effective community responses, and experienced firsthand that competence and character matter more than bloodline when actual survival is at stake. This psychological shift creates the intellectual foundation for what historians will later call Renaissance humanism, the revolutionary idea that individual human beings possess inherent dignity and potential regardless of their social origins. When plague survivors rebuild their communities, they often create institutions and practices that reflect these new assumptions about human worth and capability. Towns that lost their traditional leadership develop more participatory decision-making processes. Craft guilds that suffered massive membership losses begin accepting members based on skill rather than family connections. Even surviving noble families discover they need to earn respect through competent service, rather than simply demanding it through inherited authority. The economic changes prove equally persistent and transformative. The labor shortage that gave workers unprecedented bargaining power during the immediate post-plague period establishes new expectations about wages, working conditions, and employment. Relationships that persist even as population levels gradually recover. Workers who have experienced genuine economic leverage prove remarkably resistant to returning to traditional subservient arrangements, creating ongoing pressure for more equitable economic relationships. These labor market changes contribute to the development of what economic historians recognize as early capitalist institutions, systems where workers and employers negotiate terms based on market forces rather than traditional social obligations. The idea that labor has measurable economic value independent of social status represents a conceptual revolution that will eventually undermine the entire feudal system and contribute to the emergence of modern economic arrangements. Perhaps most significantly, the plague experience changes European attitudes toward knowledge and authority in ways that lay the groundwork for both the scientific revolution and the Protestant Reformation. Medieval people have traditionally accepted information from established authorities, church officials, classical texts, traditional practices, without feeling the need to verify claims through independent observation or experimentation. But plague survivors have watched respected authorities provide spectacularly wrong advice about medicine, social policy, and crisis management, creating healthy skepticism about claims that aren't grounded in observable reality. This intellectual shift encourages the development of empirical approaches to understanding the world, methods that emphasize direct observation, practical experimentation, and critical evaluation of traditional beliefs. When medieval medicine proves useless against plague, some survivors begin developing folk remedies based on what actually seems to help patients rather than what classical authorities recommend. When traditional religious explanations fail to account for plague patterns, some survivors begin thinking about natural rather than supernatural causes for disease outbreaks. The religious changes that emerge from plague trauma prove particularly consequential for the future development of European Christianity. The massive mortality among clergy, the obvious failure of traditional religious remedies, and the development of more personal, individualized forms of devotion during the crisis all contribute to fundamental changes in how people understand their relationships with divine authority. Many plague survivors develop what scholars call devotional individualism, the belief that personal spiritual experience might be more important than institutional religious observance. When churches prove just as vulnerable to plague as anywhere else, and when priests die at the same rates as their congregations, ordinary believers begin to question whether salvation really requires clerical mediation or whether individuals can develop direct relationships with divine power. These changes in religious authority and practice create the intellectual and spiritual conditions that will eventually make the Protestant Reformation possible. The idea that ordinary believers can interpret religious truth for themselves, that institutional church authority should be subject to critical evaluation, and that spiritual life should be based on personal conviction rather than traditional obligation, all of these concepts have their roots in the religious disruptions created by plague trauma. Here's where the transformation becomes genuinely revolutionary. The plague generation raises children who take for granted social arrangements and intellectual approaches that their grandparents would have considered radical or impossible. These children grow up in communities where social mobility is normal, where traditional authorities must prove their competence, where individual merit matters more than family background, and where established beliefs are subject to critical examination. By the time these plague-era children reach adulthood during the late 14th and early 15th centuries, they're creating art, literature, and institutions that reflect fundamentally different assumptions about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between individuals and authority. The Renaissance flowering of artistic innovation, scientific discovery, and humanistic scholarship builds directly on the intellectual and social changes that emerged from plague-era trauma. The economic innovations that developed during the post-plague period, banking systems based on market relationships rather than traditional obligations, trade networks that emphasize efficiency and profit rather than social hierarchy, and urban communities organized around commercial rather than feudal principles, create the material foundation for the cultural and intellectual achievements that define Renaissance civilization. Even the geographic expansion that characterizes the early modern period has roots in plague-era changes. Communities that have been forced to rebuild their societies from scratch develop entrepreneurial attitudes and risk-taking behaviors that make them more willing to invest in exploration, colonization, and long-distance trade ventures. The same psychological flexibility that allowed plague survivors to adapt to radically changed circumstances also makes their descendants more willing to pursue opportunities in distant lands and unfamiliar markets. By 1400, Europe has been transformed from a predominantly agricultural, hierarchical, tradition-bound medieval society into something that historians recognize as distinctly early, modern, more urban, more commercially oriented, more intellectually dynamic, and more socially mobile. The Black Death didn't just kill medieval people, it killed medieval assumptions about how society should be organized and how individuals should relate to authority, tradition, and each other. The plague survivors didn't set out to create the Renaissance, trigger the Protestant Reformation, or lay the groundwork for modern European civilization. They were simply trying to rebuild their communities and lives after experiencing unprecedented trauma. But the solutions they developed to address immediate survival needs proved to be the building blocks for social, economic, and intellectual innovations that would reshape European civilization for centuries to come. In the end, one of history's greatest disasters becomes the catalyst for one of humanity's greatest periods of cultural and intellectual flourishing. The Black Death teaches Europe that survival sometimes requires abandoning traditional ways of thinking and acting, that individual human beings possess remarkable capacity for adaptation and innovation, and That catastrophic disruption can create opportunities for positive change that would be impossible under normal circumstances. The medieval world died along with its people, but what emerged from that death proved more dynamic, more humane, and more intellectually vibrant than what had been lost. Europe awakened from its plague nightmare to discover that it had been transformed into something it never could have chosen to become, but which proved infinitely more capable of growth, discovery, and human flourishing than the world it had left behind. The Black Death ends not with answers, but with possibilities. The plague survivors have inherited a broken world, but they've also inherited the freedom to rebuild it according to new principles, new values, and new dreams that their ancestors never could have imagined. From the ashes of medieval certainty rises the early modern world's celebration of human potential, individual dignity, and the endless possibilities that emerge when people are forced to think beyond the limitations that once seemed permanent and unchangeable. In the gentle darkness of these final moments, you can almost hear the sound of a civilization being reborn, carried on the whispers of survivors who refused to let catastrophe have the final word in their story. The Black Death took everything medieval Europe thought permanent and revealed it to be as fragile as morning mist. But in teaching that lesson, it also revealed something more precious and more durable than any institution or tradition. The irrepressible human capacity to begin again, to build something better from the ruins of what came before, and to find hope in the most unlikely places. The plague came to Europe as death incarnate, but it left behind the seeds of renaissance, reformation, and renewal that would bloom in ways its victims never could have anticipated. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the very experiences that teach us who we really are and what we're truly capable of becoming. Medieval Europe discovered this truth the hard way, but the discovery transformed not just a continent, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. Close your eyes now, and let the centuries drift away like autumn leaves on a quiet breeze. The story is complete, the lessons are learned, and the long journey from medieval darkness into early modern light has reached its peaceful conclusion. Sleep well, knowing that even the darkest chapters in human history can become the foundations for brighter tomorrows that we can't yet imagine but which await us just beyond the next turn of time's gentle wheel.